Oh, all right. So welcome. UTOK and Dialogos here, Nick and Andrea. We decided we're going to tackle some questions about mind and consciousness. Nick, you just rattle off some questions, but why don't we go back to that if you can? And you raised a few excellent questions that I think need to be sorted out.
Sure. So I'll just go ahead and restate that point and then just let you riff off of it.
Perfect.
So in thinking about mind too, and where that resides sort of ontologically, the thought I had was that ideographic insight is the complexifying and diversifying feedback loop at the level of phenomenological experience within the dimension of mind. There's your level versus dimension argument that represents the or a key insight that is a non-dual insight in the enlightenment gaps. Kind of, where we don't want to talk about the mind because we don't know what it is, and God forbid we get it wrong. And then what that is what I see it as is what you call the unknown knower.
Yes. Okay. So lots of different really things to piece out here, piece apart and get clear on. Some of which are epistemological, some of which are ontological, things like that. So let's get clear about what we're referring to in mind one, mind two, mind three. Okay? Then it's easiest to do it epistemologically, I think, and then we'll do it ontologically some. Okay.
Sure.
So from the vantage point of an exterior, meaning you're on the outside, third person looking in, okay? The argument is that I have access to animal behavior from a third person perspective, right? Basically the overt activity at a behavioral level. My dog, you'll see my dog, I see my fish over there, okay? So that's called mind 1B, and that's your, our access. We can then look and see where does that, what generates that, or at least mediates that, and we find the nervous system, okay? And then we can build models of the nervous system. And I would argue the cognitive revolution gave us a ontological now, a claim from a third person, hey, the nervous system should be, or seems to be, or can be modeled as an information processing system, okay?
Yep.
Now, all of these are recent developments, at least relative to science writ large, okay? But what science, and by science, we should be very clear, modern empirical natural science as it comes out of Europe, okay? Like the yogi sciences or many Indian sciences hold interior and exterior perspectives as part of the task. Like you have to then deal with both of these, okay? Yep. The modern empirical natural science view that emerges from in Galileo into Newton on the one hand, and then there's a philosophy, Locke and Hume into Kant in another, they stay more dual than non-dual, okay? And they basically then punt, I would argue, from a first-person qualitative view that is empirical, is what empirical means in the 12th century and 13th century, okay? So you go out, you observe, and you see. And then really there's an unbelievable worldview change with Copernicus and Galileo about the nature of the knowledge and the correspondence theory of truth, whereby the argument from really Aristotle is you have perceptions and they get mapped onto the external world and you see stuff, and the functional grip, use a term from John Vervaeke, is what constitutes knowledge. And as long as everybody can justify, see the grip, then you have good correspondence, okay? That was the belief. That's what you needed. You needed to have first person correspondence. I see it as a cup, you guys see it as a cup, whatever. If I'm hallucinating, it's not a cup. If I think about it and interact with it poorly in a functional way, then I don't have good truth. But if we all agree and I engage functionally with it, then you have enough justification for your interior and exterior map. And that's what the Aristotle really version of truth is, okay? It's functional mapping, gripping, all right? But then what happens with Copernicus into Galileo is part of that functional map was everybody agreed that the Earth was here, okay, and that the sun rotated around it, okay, and that the sun was moving, and we could perceive that, and we could operate off of that, and we could work from that from our own subjective perspective way of being in the world. And then the realization, oh my God, there are moons around Jupiter, and then there's a Copernican view of the center of the sun and the solar system, and all these other kinds of ideas started to emerge that says, even though we are all in agreement with our perception, okay, we can discover that, and even though that works, it's also potentially deeply misguided, okay? So the heliocentric model raises deep questions about the epistemological justifiability of this sort of functional correspondence relation on the one hand, all right? And then that creates a particular process that we need to go systematically observe, test these logical propositions about the way the world works, okay? And in the process of testing that and systematizing it, they generate some really important epistemological developments, which was not really present in Aristotle's science. Aristotle was big on description and classification and coherence, but they didn't have systematic measurement and quantification, and they didn't have as much systematic attention to experimentation either, okay? So systematic measurement, quantification, and experimentation, and the development of the fundamental difference between primary qualities, which are then be quantified, and then perspectival secondary qualities, like, for example, the difference between an electromagnetic wavelength, that is out here, and my experience of color. Quality is a color, wavelength is a primary quantifiable quality. So you have secondary, primary, and then science then emerges to justify the world not through secondary qualities that are perceived from mind two directly, okay, but then are referenced quantifiably from a third person empirical perspective. So what becomes truth in the world is what can become quantifiably organized and argued to be the primary quantifiable properties of the world, okay? And then science then builds a language system based on third person quantifiable primary and the elimination of idiographic subjective quality.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basic. So now the language game itself, the grammar then of what epistemologically can be justified, okay, is that, hey, you can only justify it if you measure it and you then experiment on it and you show independent, dependent variable relation, and that can be reliably and validly determined in an intersubjective, quantifiable way. Well, intersubjective quantification is the exact creates an unbelievable epistemological hole for an idiographic, unique, unreliable perspective taking. It's like, hey, I saw this shit, okay? And that has no justification in relationship to science. No one gives a shit what you saw, okay? They're hallucinations as far as science is concerned until you correspondingly truth it, quantifiably truth it, and then develop some sort of causal explanation in relation. Okay? So that's the unknown knower hole across the epistemological gap is subjectivity. Okay?
Right.
All right, so there's an epistemological gap of subjectivity. Now, there are a couple of different ways we can then think about this, okay? In terms of one way to think about it, we still can think about it scientifically if you afford the idea of, well, okay, subjectivity is there, okay? And we can do things like get people to report on it. I can tell you, hey, I am seeing a white cup, and this is what Wundt did, okay? And he says, this is what you see, and blah, blah, blah. And other people see a white cup, and we can imagine that there is some process by which you construct the subjective conscious experience of being. Okay? Now, even there, to create a model of subjectivity, a generalizable model of subjectivity, is different than the idiographic experience of subjectivity.
Right.
Okay? The generalizable model is how does subjectivity work for all of us? That's the best that science can do.
Yeah.
Okay? It can never get to the idiographic, specific, historical contingent, unique and unreliable perspective of the knower from the vantage point of their own phenomenology, their unique perspectival Gregg. Okay, So science sees whatever it would be that is unreliable and unique to me and can't be generalized to anybody else as error. That's just unaccountable, there's contingent error. There's no explanation to be given. There's nothing to be said other than, well, there's other variables that might operate, blah, blah, blah. And to the extent that it's left over, whatever's idiographic, unique, and left over is contingent error. And there's nothing to be explained there from a scientific perspective or talked about. It just is what it is. That can't be explained. You decide, well, whatever. Now, from a first person perspective, that's my life. That is what I am. I'm this unique, idiographic, unreliable, contingent reporter that happens to have 5 goldfish in my fucking thing and a dog named Benji and develops a unified theory, right? I mean, there's no theory of human self that says, oh, that's what the self is. They have 5 goldfish, a dog named Benji. All of that's unique, idiographic, historical contingency crap. Okay. Yeah. So that's an unbelievable thing for us to be aware of. John Vervaeke and I are very clear on this, that the language game of science, okay, is not unique, idiographic, contingent. That's unreliable, specific error relative to whatever the causal, inductive laws and abductive explanation that we're after in science, okay? So science can say things like, oh, well, we're going to look for my investment in reinforcement. We're going to look for things like my social influence. We're going to look for this, at least now unified theory science, that's now going to look for how I justify. Those are generalizable causal processes that we can now bring to bear to interpret, but it doesn't specify the historical, unique, idiographic contingency. Okay.
Sure.
So that's okay. So there's that. The point. And so I want to then say that science needs to know. The blog I just did argued, and I'm growing off of this, is argued that the attempt to bring mind into scientific discourse has been very contentious and very confusing. This is part of the Enlightenment gap. So matter mind is ubiquitous. Okay. The unified theory says that there are 3 things that we have missed or have seen in only indirect, and the unified theory takes all these, grabs them by the balls and says, here they are with clarity, all right? So the first thing that it says is the life to mind joint point. Well, the first thing it says is actually, from a science perspective, we can define mind behaviorally and should, we can and should, okay? And says, hey, there's a whole dimension of animal behavior. What animal behavior is mental behavior. The ways in which animals behave as complex active bodies, and we can then see the functional awareness and response of animals, okay, as mental behavior mediated by their complex active bodies and their nervous system. And that's a scientific view. We can measure that and we can test that, and you can bring them into experimental labs, and we can go out in nature and we can watch how birds talk to each other, chirping and all that shit, and all of that's behavioral, ethology. We can do that, okay? And the unified theory says that the proper language term for that is mind with a capital M, which we call behavior or at least like somebody like Skinner calls operant behavior. That's a mistake. You should just call it mental behavior. If you called it mental behavior, we would have had a much better metaphysical alignment, okay, with our language concepts. All right. And there's a joint point. And it's a selection joint point, Andrea. Yes. Behavioral selection operating on the animal as a whole relative to the contingencies and consequences, okay, that it emits and then selects and builds. And we now know that we can build a 4E cognitive neuroscience view of this as the nervous system's a predictive processing system, okay, that's tracking relevance realization, anticipating what's going to create a return on its investment as it builds a model of what the environment is and has motives to what it wants to see, and then it creates predictive processing models. So we actually now have a good neurocognitive model, okay, that's sort of a good ingrained embodied information processing model system with 4E cognition and people like Carl Friston's predictive processing and John Vervaeke's recursive relevance realization, all right? So that we can now see, hey, this is how this system could operate on the world to generate the behavior patterns that we see from an outside, okay? There are now, from a scientific perspective, there are 2 serious problems when we try to get to what you are saying, when we go from mind one, thinking about it as a hierarchically arranged neuroinformation processing system that's cybernetically organizing behavior, that's mind one into mind 1A into mind 1B moving around. But then the fundamental question is, well, do my fish have a perspective on the world? Okay, that we would recognize as an interior phenomenological vantage point. We don't know. To this day, I would say we don't know. You know, that's an open question. The late consciousness people, and mostly like in global neuronal workspace people, they based on what we can see in mammals and humans, the subjective requirements that are active in the brain on the frontal lobe and, you know, blah, 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 you can get into the specifics, are not really present in fish, and they may well be robots, okay? Meaning, what do I mean? They're just activating, they're complex, obviously they perceive functionally, but they don't necessarily have a first-person perspective. I'm an ancient consciousness person. Ancient consciousness people say, once you get a brain and a complex operant system moving around, you probably are going to start the process of generating the emergence of a first-person perspective, okay? And I think that it comes with pleasure and pain as the fundamental organizing. I could talk about that. But clearly, if you buy that argument, then fish almost certainly have the experience of pleasure and pain, and they have some sensory detection, an inner life on a screen, essentially, then feeling that has input sensory aspects and output feeling, you know, good, bad aspects, okay?
Right.
But we can't see that. And that's the epistemological problem. You can never see it directly, okay? Then there's also the ontological problem, okay? Scientific ontological problem that says we still don't really know. We got a lot of good neural correlates, okay? But we don't know really why. And people differ a little bit about how much we don't know why, okay? The hard problem of consciousness people that really embrace this say we are completely clueless still as to what it is that's going on in the nervous system, either inside the nervous system or in the universe at large, that generates subjectivity. Like, we're completely mysterious about that, okay? Other people say that's way overshooting it. We've learned a hell of a lot. We're making progress. Our brain imaging techniques and other things are happening. So we're really narrowing it down, okay? And you can argue, we can get into what's a better argument, okay? I think it's very hard, but I don't think some people way overshoot how little, you know, I think we've actually made a significant amount of progress, okay? But there's still definitely an ontological problem. So with the ontological and epistemological problem, our scientific generalized knowledge of mind two is very difficult, okay? And even that will never grant us idiographic knowledge of the specifics. We'll always be doing generalized application. That's the best for scientific epistemological justification. That's the best it can do, okay? And therefore there is a gap, there's a hole. There is, in the language system itself, there will be by definition places that science will not be able to look. Why do you mean by definition? The language game rules that science plays by says, no, but you really can't look in here. Because whatever you claim, we don't have any way to create a reliable, valid articulation. We have massive limitations. But a different epistemological system, especially one that then if you switch it and you start from first person, you say, actually, the one thing I am 100% certain of is I am conscious, if you start there, right? And so my epistemic process, the ontic reality of my epistemic process is the foundation of my true knowledge position. That's, you know, that's the Rene Descartes sort of says that, and many of the Eastern traditions say that that's a far better epistemological grounding than anything that science generates.
I agree.
Yeah. So, and I certainly agree that my argument is that there's different epistemological, metaphysical arenas here, okay? And if it's a theory of knowledge is what we're really talking about, and knowledge systems have different kinds of epistemologies, they play by different rules, and it depends, you create a metaphysical arena and you say, these are the rules, and if these are the rules and frames, then certain things get justified and certain things don't, based on that process. There's an aptness and justificability depending on the frame. So science says that's bullshit. That's a bunch of subjective bullshit. People have been telling themselves the last thing we care about is your subjective understanding of your epistemic process of what's going on inside. As far as we're concerned, science, that's a fucking hallucination that doesn't get us anywhere. Cut your head off and we start going to do an experiment. I mean, that's a totally different epistemological frame. Yeah. And my point is, actually, that isn't totally different. It's very useful, but it automatically now is language gaming you and aspectualizing certain aspects of the environment, and automatically is deprivileging other aspects by its definition.
Yeah.
So why don't we have a structure? And that this is what the tree, coin, and garden is. The tree, coin, and garden says science affords us a particular kind of objective frame of reference. Okay. And it's about factoring out subjective and moral knowledge and yielding an epistemological game that yields the best objective description of what is. Okay, that's what it does. And that's great. That's an unbelievably powerful tool, but it's blind in certain ways. It absolutely is not. There's no way to get the easiest way to see it's blind is, well, what does it tell us about what is good? I mean, it doesn't say anything about what is good. If we go over to morality, right? It doesn't say anything about what is good. So clearly, if we think that there are good questions asked about what is good, science is obviously grossly limited in an overall philosophy. You cannot get truth. There's no universal truth coming from science itself. It's a tool to see certain universal truths that it specializes based on its epistemological frame. And then it undermines other possible tools. Okay. So the tree then says, here's your best overall map of enduring psychological knowledge knitted together in a coherent way that actually makes sense. That's what the tree then affords you. Okay, so extract that. Here you go. And then the garden says, hey, actually, if you actually want to live in the world and make decisions about how to be in the world, you have to add what ought to be, and what can be and what should be, and how do we live together? And the garden then creates a particular kind of collective mythopoetic ethos, or invites you to say you got to generate some narrative, shared collective narrative that bridges is and ought together to then decide how your polis is going to be, how you're going to live in a group society. What is the shared system of understanding that you can get? How would you judge legally whether something's right or not? All of the laws and collective decision-making that bridge is and ought in us as a group together is a totally different process. So you would never rule somebody by science. You have to translate that into value generative thinking. And the garden represents that. So this is intersubjective, mythic, ethic kinds of frames of reference. And neither one of them are appropriate and don't have anywhere near the same epistemological considerations as me, as Gregg, from my first person ontic epistemic reality. That is, nothing is more real for me than my first person experience of being. And that's so the tree is science, the coin is me, and the garden is the mythopoetic intersubjective moral ethic. And they argue that they're three different epistemological systems, and play by different rules and do different things for us. And there are ways to afford much greater effective interrelation between these three different epistemological points.
So you mentioned the ontological problems there, and I know, Andrea, you had mentioned the other day your kind of doubts about the evolutionary components of the mind in the terms of like selection, retention, variation, if I'm remembering that right. So the way I'm kind of seeing this is that, and I think this is kind of the way, correct me if I'm wrong, Gregg, but this is the way that UTOK posits it, is that mind one is essentially the ontological root for mind 2 and 3, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so then if that's the case, then we can look at selection, retention, variation at the level of mind 1 as, blindly, ow, that hurt, don't go that way. Okay, I can go this way. It's just finding what works. That's the selection, and it retains what works, and different things work, and that's where you get the variability. Now, eventually we evolve, we get more complex brain. This is probably still within mind, maybe a little bit, but it's kind of a bridge even between within mind and mind and person is that the subjective experience, then the idiographic experience is like, in my mind, it's emblematic of selection, variation, retention in that same way from just for me. This is my selection. I select. I retain what works for me. I am, having all this variety of experience that may or may not be exactly or exactly the same as what you experience, or totally freaking different. Who knows? Because we have that gap there. And then furthering that, we have, mind 3, and it's just obviously a bit oversimplified, but where we get the intersubjective, where now we're trying to make sense of, okay, I have this perception and you have this perception, and how do we connect those dots? And that's where we get culture and justification. So ontologically speaking, they would have the same sort of root in biology, right? Not reduced to that, not reducible to that, emergent of that, but still, possessing that sort of an intransitive state. And I'm kind of framing this as a problem that isn't a problem, in that it seems that it would continue to evolve in a way that would solve itself, that would bridge itself together, because we're kind of starting to circle back to mind 1 with third person empiricism in that way. Does that make sense? Am I explaining that?
Yeah, certainly there's lots that does make sense there. Yeah. I certainly can hold that and follow that. Yes.
Okay. So at that point, we have technology, we have, what's coming up with the 5th joint point in the digital age. And for the idiographic part of me, that's terrifying, because it's going to compute me. It's going to, like you're saying, I'm error now. I'm unnecessary variability that can now be, algorithmically just factored out. And maybe so. Perhaps that's exactly the way it should be, which would lead us to that next point, that maybe that is the way that we transcend all of this kind of fragmented cultural nonsense. Or maybe not, I don't know. And I guess that's why I'm kind of
to me, that requires, there are a couple of things there in that transition. So definitely we can decide, right, how much to value that error, basically. I mean, and that's right. Certainly, there's no deductive decision that a way to decide the right amount to value somebody's subjectivity. I mean, that different systems, right, you can weight that in different ways, and certainly I think that there are general value-based principles that virtually everybody would agree with, and indeed. We're seeing definitely different visions about what a transhuman, transpersonal digital world will be, with some people basically having the love of technology AI vision of like, yes, we can upload ourselves and, there's that, can we do that? We have the knowledge, and is that even ontologically feasible? Probably not, but there's a fantasy that we could. And some people will have that as a view as unbelievably beautiful and the next wave, and that would be great, that we would merge with, the virtual digital world, and we'll transcend these weak, limited shells of bodies, and we will be wonderful. A lot of other people think about that as just the definition of horror, right? It's like, oh my God, that's an unbelievably alienating and corrupting view of, what we are, unbelievably dangerous and crazy. If you have any conservatism in you, you think that's an insane idea generally. So it's like, that's another whole set of questions to really about, is that feasible on the one level, but then there's the whole value system. I certainly am saying that, those value systems, I don't know how you would deduce those. Those would be arguments and collectives that a mythopoetic narrative about what our natures are would then justify whether or not it's okay and good for us to do that. And that's to be seen enormously. But there'd be I'm pretty resistant to turning this all into some sort of digital upload.
Right. Well, and so if it became this sort of, this sort of algorithm, then really it wouldn't be so much about what values are true, but it was just, Darwinian, universal Darwinism, with what values win.
Well, I guess we'd have to talk about, are we talking about our decisions to try to make this happen on the one hand, or are we simply talking about what we will observe to happen? So those are two, one's a tree objective perspective. We will simply see what happens on one level, right? I mean, you just step outside of it and say, well, this is what's going to happen. Maybe we'll blow ourselves up, or maybe we'll build this digital thing. Maybe who knows what's going to happen. We can describe what's going to happen from a particular perspective, or we can talk about what we want to actively see happen. And that's when we start talking about what we want, when we get to the cusp of this space between present and future, then the argument actually is you now have to bring in values to at least be actively participating in that way. And so I'm not sure if I hear, because I would answer that in two different ways. I would say my observer perspective is, there's variation, selection, retention, and that's what's going to happen. My moral perspective is, Jesus, here's what I hope happens, and these are my values as to why.
So, and with that, I would also say we have to then bring in the concept of free will or agency and choice, and what is it a thing? How much of a thing is it, and what is it? And the way I'm kind of thinking about it right now is, I
tell you what, why don't I push pause here, and because that was, I think, a good sort of rundown. But if we're going to, okay.
So just to link to what you were saying, I have three feedbacks basically. The first is about Chalmers' hard problem. So we've been talking a lot about mind one and mind two, namely our objective neural system and our subjective perspective on the world. And personally, I find myself satisfied with the panpsychist assumption, and so that, in my opinion, managed to resolve the hard problem basically. And so I was wondering about your resolutions of the hard problem are. That's the first question. The second question is about is about the universal Darwinism applied to the mind plane of existence. So we were saying that I have to clarify what I meant in my mail, and so what I meant is that I certainly agree that we can frame the retention of some behaviors due to the punishment or reinforcement dynamics. And they also vary, of course. Okay, so we have the selection and the retention parameters of the universal Darwinism that are satisfied, in fact. But I am more skeptical about the selection, retention variation. So sorry, I am more skeptical about the retention part because the concept of retention in the mind plane of existence is intergenerational, is transgenerational, is from one generation to the next one. Okay, because my genes are selected, but my genes vary and are selected, therefore, and I pass them to my offspring, and so on and so on. So the retention is transgenerational, while the retention applied to the mind plane of existence is intergenerational.
Sure.
At least if we...
Or intragenerational, so it's within the individual. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, within the individual.
Yep.
Of course, we can say that if we take culture in, there are some behaviors that can be copied from one generation to the next, but that's another issue. And so that's the second question about the universal Darwinism. And finally, the third issue is also linked to the first one, and it is about again the relationship between mind one and mind two. And I recently read an article about consciousness, about a new standard model of consciousness. Dennett also praised this article by a team led by Graziano. I think it is a scientist based in New York. I know, but it doesn't matter the specific details about their mechanistic model of consciousness that is about the theory of mind and basically an attention schema. The consciousness is like is like a schema of attention similar to what our body schema are. Okay, yeah. But that's not what matters. What matters is that they have this purely eliminativistic or illusionist account of mind two, and it blew my mind. It blew my mind how you can try to explain consciousness if you deny its existence from a first person perspective. And so I think Dennett is a great philosopher. I really respect him, but I really can't understand how you can support an account of consciousness which is at the same time saying that consciousness, at least if intended in a first-person perspective, does not exist. It seems to me like a paradox, and so I want to blend over these feedbacks together, and so the panpsychist thing, the thing about the retention, and finally this paradox. I would like we talk about this paradox of denying the existence of consciousness and at the same time wanting to study it. So that's all.
Okay. All right. So we'll start with panpsychism. I don't see the value of panpsychism at a level beneath life. I don't meaning, I don't know what I never have heard, and we can talk about this. I never have heard of or seen any valuable ontological metaphysical argument about thinking about bits of consciousness in atoms or water molecules or whatever. So I'd be open if you find some aspect of that. I'd be open to hearing that. I will say that there is some utility in emphasizing sort of what might be called a Markov blanket analysis of positionality, energy, and information. And what I mean by that is we can certainly note that the position of a molecule or whatever, it's information. What it has informationally, contact with is a function of position in a particular kind of way, and then it's networked in a particular kind of world. And if you think about the network world of object in relation and the different position of inside and out, you get some analogies. But to me, that's just sort of an epistemological analogy, not really an ontological analogy. So we can talk some about that. I would say, if I can, I would say that for me, the panpsychism is the only logical possibility of the existence of the first person perspective, because I cannot see how the subjective can emerge from the objective. So my answer is, probably the subjective has always existed. So objective and subjective have always been sort of the two different sides of the same coin. Right. So to answer your concern about the utility of seeing a
molecule consciousness. Of course, I don't believe that an atom or a molecule can feel things like living beings or humans can.
But it has a little bit of consciousness in it?
Yeah.
It's inseparable.
I think so.
From what
I think so.
consciousness is.
Right. So yeah.
That's what I would say, because knowledge does not separate itself into subject object. We separate it like that. At this level, at this dimension, we separate it. It does not separate itself.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk some about, what gets separated and then what, from those of us that take this perspective, they say, yeah, there is something, consciousness is an emergent property, you can lose it. I mean, it makes sense to say something is lost, you lose consciousness completely under various circumstances. And then we can talk a little bit about, I was listening to some of the yogic perspectives. They're like, well, that's wakefulness. Okay. That's not consciousness. Okay.
Yeah. Maybe consciousness is not the right word, but and also I don't think that an atom can have the subjective feeling of being a thing separated from the cosmos. What I think is that there is that consciousness, that in order to reconcile the subjective and the objective, from my perspective, the only possibility to be is that consciousness, or let's call it awareness, or I don't know what word is the better, but the subjectivity writ large has always existed. Yeah.
Yeah. See, I mean, to me, I see it as an emergent phenomenon. So I basically see what happens with life is a very, very big deal. And
yeah, of course.
Systems emerge so that, first you get a lipid layer, which creates a boundary. That's one key part. So you get a really systematic inside-outside kind of thing that is not present. Then you get whatever the information store of a life system is, that's, then regulated and maintained through some energy flow. So now you get an energy information flow, whereby a cell, I think you can certainly argue, has an epistemic process in it. Epistemic,
yeah, of course,
a knowing process, makes decisions.
Cellular cognition, of course.
Cellular cognition. I don't know why. I mean, knowledge then, so there's little knowledge in atoms or pan epistemics to me, epistemic processes emerge, and they emerge as a function of, and it is these epistemic processes that actually, when I talk about consciousness, at least, it's these epistemic processes that provide the dynamic ground, the dynamic autopoietic ground that's going to create a field that gets tied together, that ultimately everything I mean by consciousness is an emergent out of that field. And it is the neurobiological ground that then creates an arena that then there's a meta supervening arena of dynamic action on top of that. So I see basically panpsychic down into life in some ways, in the sense that there are parts of consciousness down into life. It's not collected together in something that I would call wakeful consciousness at a cell level, but there are parts of that then do get coalesced together. But the parts do not, they drop out at matter. So that's where I'm basically at. It's like life has epistemic parts. It's the epistemic parts that come together in the neurobiological animal system that gives rise to what we would call consciousness, qualia. And that's an emergent collective phenomenon that somehow it creates, the brain then creates a unified field of experience. We can talk about what my unified field frame would be on some of that, but it's speculative. That's the hard problem, is like making that jump is a lot of hand waving. Yeah, but I think I think there's a functional. I mean, John and I called it untangling the world knot. I think there's a lot of pieces in place that say you have it relatively well contained, the argument wise. So that's why I like panpsychism down to life, if the parts, but it just drops out for me in terms of its utility once you get to just dead matter. But
the problem for me is you said somehow. The problem is that somehow. So I really can't see how can be there can be a bang of a boom of subjective experience out of the living matter. But I don't want to continue this issue. We can go on.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's I think that just like we don't really know there's a bang of life out of matter, I consider that to be still between a mystery and a problem. The emergence of life itself is in between a mystery and a problem. And I would consider the emergence of sentience in the animal kingdom between a mystery and a problem. Meaning a mystery is like, whoa, I can't figure a handle on that at all. And it's sort of that. When a problem is, it's kind of boxed in now. There's certainly some ways that we're making progress on it, and it feels less mysterious than it might have 100 years ago, certainly. So that's.
So I would say, even though below the dimension of life, consciousness would not at all be the right word for it. I think we can agree on that. But there is some intelligence, because there is a method, there is a process, right? It's that process that unfolds that allows the emergence to occur. It's not just random.
It's definitely there's clearly lawful constraints that emerge. I would be, intelligence, for me, intelligence, that's what life-based epistemic emergence. Like there are systematic dynamic organizing features that they're all of the four forces of gravity and electromagnetic radiation, strong and weak, create systematic processes that are that can then be extracted and say, oh, that's what that is. That's what gravity is. That's why the thing falls in a particular way. But I mean, falling to the earth is not a small indicator of intelligence. I don't think that intelligence would add anything to why. Well, this is the Aristotelian view that then at least modern empirical science rejects. Aristotelian had a teleological view of behavior, ultimately, that there was a sense of purpose, that the heavy things were trying to get to their final ultimate purposeful resting place at the center of the earth, and that's why they fell. And that description affords that to me is sort of what gets turned over. It's like matter, once you have the explanatory force equals matter, mass times acceleration, and other classical mechanical explanations, the thing is engaged in a classically lawful deterministic unfolding of the process. That is not really, that doesn't have any epistemic intelligent process that's guiding it in any way.
Okay. Yeah. So what makes us think that we have that now? Because we can experience it now. We can be aware of it now from that ideographic vantage point. But outside of that, what makes us think that any of life is any different?
Because to me, this is, so if you the best way for me, so Aristotle tries to explain all behavior through four metaphysical causes. Okay, so there's substance, and he uses a different definition we have, but there's substance and kinetic. Okay, so it's like there's some core substance, which he doesn't really mean this, but we can update this and basically say, what's the atomic substructure of the thing? What's its shape and size? And then how does it exist in a field? Okay. And then what's the movement around it? That's kinetic. What are the forces that are acting on it, and how does that unfold? Okay. Mm-hmm. He then also said there were functional forms, like, this is a functional form in relationship. It holds water or coffee or does something, and that functional form gives a cause. And then finally, there's a teleological cause, which is that it sits in some purpose somewhere. Either it has a purpose or is generated by a purpose. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, and he argued that was true for everything. I would argue that Galileo comes along and tries to metaphysics has gone crazy, and he wants the minimalist metaphysics that can also then be empirically sort of yoked, so you don't have to, project that. And he basically says, hey, there's substance and there's movement, matter and motion. Okay. And then he engages in a metaphysical, empiricism that basically says, hey, we're going to try to explain everything through the unfolding of matter and motion, bouncing into itself. Okay. The physicalists in the world, that are still physicalists in the world, reductive physicalists, believe that is all you need. And ultimately, in the end of the day, all that we see, all the complexity that we see would be reduced There'd be a single cone of complexity and everything could be reduced that way. Okay, that's one argument. Now, my position on the tree of knowledge, okay, is that new functional processes are emergent. All right. And for example, cells have functional organization in them, okay, that have to be explained at the particular level of organization, the way they operate as epistemic processors of information. Okay. So that to understand what a cell is actually doing, it's detecting forms in its environment. Okay, it's metabolizing those and has memory built in through the eons of natural selection that creates an information store based then also on its own experience that then causes it to make decisions that are functional and purposeful. Okay, and that those functional and purposeful metaphysical descriptions are necessary and can never be reduced to the language and causation of physics. That's what makes me an ontological emergentist. Okay, that's meaning that the information store complexification inside a cell is part of the irreducible causal action of why a cell behaves the way it does. That you can't just, well, if we really knew, then it's actually just the position of quantum in every position. And ultimately, position of quantum in every position is what gives rise to the causation anyway. It's all about that. And then we have to create these shorthands of these macro level systems, but really it's just a micro level position. The physical reductionist says, no, it's just a micro level position. I say there have been complexity building feedback loops that build networks of relation, okay, in to understand that network of relation would be to try to understand like this entire conversation. It would be like saying, well, the only really causes are letters. Letters are what cause everything. Words and sentences don't really exist, okay? And we can understand everything about this conversation by analyzing all the letters in the words. I mean, nobody really thinks that, and it's like, that's ridiculous, actually. Letters get yoked up into words, and words have sentences, and then the functional form of a sentence as it comes out of me enters you. You get the gist of the sentence that's not caused by the letters, but it's caused by the gist. You metabolize the gist and you operate. So the functional form of a sentence cannot be reduced to the words or the letters. It operates at a particular causal space, and you would never be able to explain stuff by the particulate in that way. The nature of epistemic information processing units in the world means that functional forms have causal properties that cannot be explained by physics because they have macro level organizational functional form properties by virtue of epistemic knowers. So once epistemic knowers got happening, cause became, there's another layer of causation, and the jump into life, my argument, and biology is qualitatively more irreducible to chemistry than chemistry is to matter. Like there's a different kind of emergence to go from physics to chemistry. When you go from chemistry to biology, you get another layer of causation, which we can frame as epistemic information processing and communication between forms that then have particular causal consequences that cannot be explained in the language of physics. At least that's the tree of knowledge. Scientific worldview B says it can be. The Sean Carroll's of the world says it can be. I'm just being pragmatic. Scientific worldview C says no. We've introduced another epistemic causal process that can't be broken down in the language of physics. And this is a big, philosophers of science and emergence and everything else have different takes on this. The TOK, advocates for a stronger emergent view.
But you can't take away, I can't take away my cells. I am emergent from my cells, but I can't take away my cells and still be here.
Right.
So that's, the include and transcend.
And there will be then also the argument is that your brain does aggregate and functional analysis of your cells as a whole and generates aggregate forms interpreted of them and operates based on those aggregates. And those aggregates then have their own causal properties as you get into aggregate structures. Yeah. And then you move up. And as aggregate structures impact other things in the world, okay, you can only then explain them through their aggregate structure functional form. You can't then particulate them out. That then becomes nonsensical. So there's no, and if the language forces you to particulate them out, but you lose all explanatory power, then you can't the only way to explain, another way of saying this is the only way to explain what's happening in this conversation is at the level of justification. Yep. We are processing linguistic information and semantic propositional meaning statements, questioning those and operating, and the sound of our systems, you never reduce it to sound waves. It has to be, can only be thought of in terms of the informational content that is being offered and processed and metabolized and then iterated. That's the argument, at least. That's why it's a fourth dimensional conversation.
So, for example, about this issue of emergence, I am more cautious, and I prefer to think about only of epistemological emergentism rather than ontological one.
Goddamn scientific worldview beer! Yeah. That violates TOK! What are you doing, Andre?
Because I read a lot of accounts of downward causation, but I've never understood it. So one option is that I'm dumb. It can be. The other option is that my impression is that all the arguments for downward causation are a bit shaky. But maybe I'm wrong, of course.
How do you explain how we respond to each other in this conversation? Like, what's your what?
I don't know. I'm simply agnostic. Agnostic about it. I mean, I think that of course it's absurd from every point of view. To think that we can explain what is happening from a semantic point of view, thanks to physics, always, of course. And so we need a vantage point of justification of symbols and culture and worldviews and so on. But I do not know if ontologically justifications are more than the very ultimate quantum particles that make up our universe. It can be, but I am not. I don't feel safe in claiming myself a strong emergentist. So I don't believe that strong emergentism is false per se, but that is too much difficult to endorse it from my perspective.
Right. And on that term, John got me, he didn't want me using strong emergence. So I'm now mostly saying ontological. He was like, no, there's a history, you want to stay away from it. I looked into it and I was debating, blah, blah, blah. I like it. Strong is better. It's easy, strong versus weak. And some people offer very reasonable. But anyway, I told John I would no longer be using strong. But the point of it is very clear in my estimation. That's what the diagram of the tree of knowledge, so you either believe there's one cone or four or however many, and my argument is that epistemic processes and information processing, communication processes cannot have functional form causation that carry their causation in the information that they hold and are metabolized by other knowers, and that level of there's an ontic reality of epistemic process.
So what is the ontology of epistemology? There has to be an ontological thing of it. Like what is a thought physically? Right. What is it?
I mean, to me, the language of information processing affords us a pretty clear way of framing that, and it also addresses this issue. I mean, that's the argument basically is that life, mind, and culture, like Aristotle is right that the psyche is a particular kind of functional form, and life, mind, and culture are radically different kinds of metaphysical, ontological categories in the world. And the reason is because there are emergent causations that emergent complex dynamic, organization. Complex dynamic adaptive systems, autopoiesis, all of these other things are chaotic, a little bit of chaotic, whatever.
Yeah.
These are, people have different opinions about them. Where I think we're all clear in saying, you can lean one way or the other. Everyone agrees that the pragmatic epistemological view of emergentism is required. Whether there's an ontological case, the TOK makes the ontological case through information processing and communication for ontological emergence, and the shape and structure of the TOK, the nature of the joint points, and what it affords in terms of organizing the behavior patterns in nature, and affords you a naturalistic behavioral ontology. That's why I'm always bitching about the strong reductionists. I want to elbow them out of the way and give rise to this scientific ontology, but we'll see.
And so, what about the issue about the retention, intragenerational or transgenerational?
Right. Learning and memory is basically other words for the whole point of it is that the variation, selection, and retention can be very clearly seen. Skinner refers to himself as the Darwin of operant behavior, the Darwin of learning. You admit various behaviors. Certain ones have certain consequences. You have a memory system or adjustment system so you omit variable stuff. Certain things have particular consequences that then select for you the likelihood, and there's a process by which the nervous system encodes that this outcome was predicted and evaluates whether or not it was good or bad, and then retains the likelihood that you would do it again if the situation arises similarly. So learning, I think most embodied cognition, predictive processing, and behavioral selection, behavioral science views have a variation, selection, retention model of learning. And so that's all it means. That means that what complexification, the first thing that you look at for what generates emergent complexification is a feedback cycle of a variation, selection, and retention. And I think that works well at life and mind, clearly. I think you can certainly apply it, but your point is well taken there in terms of this has been much less well developed in the level of culture. Obviously, Dawkins' concept of a meme is directly trying
Blackmore,
to impute the whole, and Blackmore,
memetics,
or whatever, picks it up as memetics and meme plexes, and the tree, the whole thing in yellow in the tree is an M-E-M-E, is a play on that. And I think the whole point about justification, what are we doing here? We're throwing out justifications. What do I do when I write? I throw out propositional narratives. I then, debate them into other variation, and then say, oh, I really like this. Then this justification holds, it organizes, and is successful. Oh, that was bullshit. Throw that out. It doesn't make any sense. It's much less systematized as a variation, selection, and retention, but in a dynamic, just can you impute that, see how systems evolve, how they justify, and what catches and what doesn't. There's a lot of cool work to be done, but it's enough for me to say, that's a reasonable frame of mind.
I agree with you, but I think that again the problem is terminology, is the terms we are using, because I prefer not to extend the terminology of a plane of existence to the next one, and because the selection, retention, and variation born to explain how genes behave. Okay, and so every time someone overextend an argument to another plane of existence, I think it can be perilous, because in my opinion, memetics. Some things memetics says are okay, but the whole argument that culture is nothing more than memes. I don't agree with it, because
I don't agree with that at all.
According to Blackmore, the song of the birds and the Christian religion are the same thing. I don't think so. I don't think so.
I don't think so at all either. Remember, they don't even have justification system theory. They don't differentiate between, and so the unit of a meme is unbelievably. Justification says there's one particular kind of meme as a propositional unit of meaning that creates counterfactuals around it and links into other systems, networks in particular ways. A justification system is a lot cooler concept than a memeplex, which is this very, very fuzzy. I mean, we can look out and see, yes, there are obviously systems of justification. Look at the Democratic versus Republican Party and the narratives and identities and values that people, propagate. You come into James Madison University, we have a mission statement, a value statement, and you sign a faculty handbook that says, this is what I promise to do and promise not to do. And you'll punish me if I don't and reward me if I do. This is, these are all clear networks of justification that are, I think, are very, you start talking about memeplexes and you equate Christian religion to a goddamn songbird, which, by the way, justification would say, no, the Christian religion is a justification system. Is not.
Of course. And also, if you think about, if you think about the very concept of cultural evolution, I think is misleading, because I've been the peer reviewer of a paper by an Australian biologist recently for integrative psychological and behavioral science, and he argued very well, in my opinion, that we should call it cultural change, because evolution is the biological evolution. The cultural change, maybe it has some parallels with the biological evolution, but as the TOK clearly points out, it is a completely different and emergent, completely different and emergent, in my opinion, epistemologically or ontologically, maybe, I don't know, but it is emergent. It is emergent. It is different, and only because
there's at least a weak ontological reality, like language. Language didn't exist before, right? And language obviously has causal properties. I mean, we wouldn't be here if it didn't have any causal properties. So clearly there is some kind of ontological causal reality, right? I'll nudge that in there.
But
anyway.
You're
right. Totally. I totally agree.
Yeah, because when you talk the jargon of an harder science, you think you are doing better stuff, but it is not. No, because you have to respect the onto-epistemological reality you are dealing with.
So I go with that.
Yeah, totally.
And so, if we have just 5 minutes, I was wondering about your thoughts about Illuminativism. I don't know if we have enough time to talk.
I'm not in any particular but you have to go. What I didn't
about the Illuminativism, about the So consciousness is just material stuff. It doesn't exist, and I really don't see the reason to be of.
So Daniel Dennett, I mean, I think most people, yes, I like Daniel Dennett. He's very bright. I find his book Consciousness Explained, his 1991 articulation of trying to obliterate the concept of qualia, which basically he tries to do. So, and essentially, there's the good part of the argument is that, qualia, and I see this like in Brent Oslop, because he tries to, like, they're clearly real and there has to be a physical one-to-one correspondence in brain activity with qualia. Actually, no, not necessarily. That's a strong argument that actually many people have argued me more or less find that's not the case. So and what exactly is qualia relative to, like, well, we can have qualia, but for example, if you take my evolutionary field view of qualia, by field, I mean there's an emergent, essentially what the metaphor is this, okay? The metaphor that I have is this, is that essentially you could think of the brain as essentially like the skin turned inward, okay? And then there are various levels of communication inside the brain, okay, that are sending out signals that allow the system, if each of the neurons are like members of stadium in the stadium of the audience, okay, then there will be different kinds of broadcast field capacities that get this audience stage members on the same focal point or not, okay? So one way to think about it is imagine, you're at a circus, right? The system's paying attention to lots of different circus acts, but sometimes there would be a focal capacity to shine it on the elephant act right now. And then all of a sudden that creates a broadcast function. And now you unify around a particular, you get starting to get the collective emergent unity function, so that now everything's tuned in to this particular signal. Okay. And the argument is that pleasure and pain are really interesting early broadcast field functions, because what they do is they get, if the circus has exterior input stuff coming, interior input stuff coming, and action stuff coming, pleasure and pain yoke those together. It says, what are you seeing? Is it good for you? And are you moving towards it in a good way? Pleasure is the yes. Okay. Pain is the shit. What are you seeing relative to how you're feeling and what's happening is bad. Okay. And so the idea that the inside of the flipped skin system can be alerted that the entire system's going bad, so stop what you're doing and withdraw for pain, or energize and do more of for pleasure, seems to me to be reasonably, and if you look at Damasio's feeling, if you look at Psalm's consciousness stuff, and the argument that all the early argument people basically are, all the affective early argument people are making this case. That's what that is. Okay. And that's a pretty good case. It's functional and hand waving, no doubt, but you have a functional, and you could say there's interior, exterior, and you could say the beginning of when the jolt of energized motion, emotional relation. There are lots of intersection that make that point. But when, how much of the broadcast functioning for how long, okay, is the idea that that is this qualia, and how long does it have to be before you get to qualia? Daniel Dennett's basic point, not that he's necessarily responding to this model per se, but this model would acknowledge the lack of clarity, the gray areas around how much broadcast function would be present before you would say something that has qualia or not, at least in the sense that you could create a dimensional analysis of, well, there's more and more brain systems that are hooking up, that are broadcasting for longer and longer. So, but there is no space in which you would say it's not, well, maybe there's some space in which you'd have happening at all, but you would say, here's the potentiality for it. It's networking some, and now it's flashing very briefly for little bits, and now it's getting longer. What is a pleasure and pain experience? Is there a clear switch? Yes or no? What Dennett was trying to do is trying to obliterate the yes-no qualia argument. Okay, that's what he's trying to do. And he argues that basically you can create a continuum around conscious functional activity, yes, no, that really it's almost like, well, we've created in our head that it either exists or doesn't, and it's easy and we need to find it. Versus, I don't agree with him, but this is his argument, is that it's much blurrier and aspects of it are far more constructed and more ambiguous. And we can imagine many situations where it's kind of in some gray area. So it's not the central problem. I don't think that's the right analysis. And I think he completely, when he gets to consciousness explained, the critic view of consciousness explained away, like now it's not a problem. Yeah. No fucking way is it not a problem. It's like you problematize the explicitness in the frames by which people say this is a problem. Fair enough. That's interesting. But you didn't get rid of the fucking problem completely, And I think really, if you listen to him, he doesn't really make that case. He effectively problematizes the clarity of the hard problem.
Yeah, because as you wrote in one of your email in the talk listserv, often hard scientists that study consciousness are they think they are eliminating consciousness, but in fact they are only eliminating magic, dualistic forces, and bad folks' argument about consciousness. And that is perfectly fine, but you are not eliminating consciousness.
John and I actually make that point repeatedly in our elusive I conversation, where people have an idea of what the self is. It's a similar kind of argument that you have a little soul inside there. When you die, it goes up to heaven. It's really making all your little homunculus decisions and is the essential thingness that you really are. And then actually science says, no, that's not a good argument. Many other, of course, traditions have said that too, but science now is saying that in a particular way. So therefore the self doesn't exist. It's like, no, therefore the dual soul doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Not everybody means, if you agree that you have a perspectival view, or if you agree you engage in self-modeling, if you agree you have an internal working models of who I am, and I have an experience of me with Nick and me versus Andrea, or me with Andy, my wife, and those are all sort of different, but I collect them together, I extend myself over time, make decisions about what I'm going to be, justify to myself what I am through some egoic function. It's like, well, all that's happening, and many cultures have sort of said more or less that's the self. Not everyone's had this dualistic, soul. So you can get rid of the dualistic soul, but not get rid of self. Many people, academics have argued, well, there is no self. No, you got rid of one feature of it. Now you want to redefine what's left, but then what's left is gone. It's like the behaviorist who basically said to study mind, we have to, as scientists, we have to go through behavior, and then made the mistake, well, then therefore mind doesn't exist. It's like, no, it's a fucking unbelievable.
Yeah. And I think that it is also an ideological legacy of the Enlightenment gap, because you are so interested in dismissing the superstitious and religious beliefs, but you are totally.
I love that. That's exactly right. That's my sense too. Yep.
Yeah, because that. Mm-hmm. You are not addressing the real problem. Okay, you are telling that the religious people and superstitious people are dumb when they talk about consciousness, and so I don't give a fuck.
Really?
Yeah, and that's very frustrating, because they are great scientists. They have great mind, and they I think they lost their time doing this shit.
No, and it's a serious issue at multiple levels. In fact, that's all part of the justification in my mind, at least for a meta-modern sensibility, is because that got so tangled up in unnecessarily side arguments that it leads to, things getting defined against each other in unproductive ways. Yeah. So we can untangle that.
Psychology's lost its mind, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yep. Exactly. And I think we can reclaim not only mind, not only subjective experience, but we can actually, and then frame that clinically in soul and spirit ways that are effectively connected to our mythos and our ideas about what's good. All in a potential language system that is far less competitive or contradictory than has been the case in the past.
Yeah, and also my impression is that the most part of these scientists are like stuck in a fantasy that is anachronistic, and that is in the 19th century again, and they have to fight with the Pope and with the Catholics, but they are not, because we as a global community, as a Western community, we do not have religions anymore. Nobody gives a fuck about. I mean, there are many who still believes in the traditional religions.
If you come over to remember, America, they were the Puritans that ran out of England. 50% of the people, probably, maybe more, in my neighborhood, believe that the earth is 5,000 to 6,000 years old as a function of literal interpretation of the Bible.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's 50%.
The presence here is still very, very, very strong.
So the American, North American version of reality is a little different. We got a lot of evangelicals that would find that.
Okay. They see the power structures. They still have the power structures. That's what it is.
So it's fascinating. But, I'm like, folks, you go back into Europe, and the priests and pastors, to the extent they're even still there, they don't have these views. So that's interesting that, you carry that history. People, I because I've been involved in these debates. It was like, well, people saw this happen and they wrote it all down. So there's a clear historical lineage. That's why we can trust it. It's like, that may not be the best argument if we know about psychology and history and all those other things and the facts of what believes. So.
Yeah, but maybe also this kind of fanatism or is due to our current uncertainty and fear. I don't know, maybe.
Well, I certainly believe that many of the, in fact, I was having good conversations with Cadell last, although he was so committed to this, then sort of we got a little bit blown up, at least from his perspective. I thought it was good. But he, as a psychoanalyst, he was very, in terms of the desires of the phallic male, fantasies to kill the father. I mean, he saw a lot of Western reductive assertions and the institution of control and the dismissal of the human as, in many ways, a fantasy that you construct to gain egoic power over the world, which I think has some, the psychoanalytic view on that. I certainly would support that lensing at various times. It certainly felt that way in some masculine academic, silverback males that I've had in contact with. So.
Yeah.
All right, so we're getting near the end, so we should put we didn't get to all your things there, Nick.
We did plenty.
So, but I'll see what's on the tape here. I love I think free will would be another, definitely. So I'm sorry we didn't circle into that.
It's a very nuanced topic, so yeah.
Maybe next time we can talk about free will.
Next time we can do that, but I will. I'll summarize this. So think about tree, coin garden as any, okay? And basically for lay people, that's seeing the world scientifically. And then the tree says that there's an objective behavioral natural ontology. That's it. Not physicalism, but behavioralism. So there's that. Then there's subjectivism, which is the epistemic ontic experience of being is what is the most real for the individual in a particular way. And you have life world, life quests, which are a unique field of being, which is like, hey, how do I want to live my life? What's my legacy? Do I want to get coffee or not? I mean, just at a very basic level. And that's another domain. And that's totally different epistemological concerns and ontic grounding of them in many ways. So and then there's the collective, mythic, poetic, ultimate narrative, where we have to think collectively about what, how are we going to take our subjective and scientific ises or whatever and turn them into a collective good as we look towards the future and things like that. So that's society or culture. So you got science, self, society, frames, intersubjective, ethical, subjective, phenomenological, objective, scientific. And Tree, Coin, and Garden provide placeholders for lensing the world that way. And it argues, these are very different epistemologies. And we don't have good philosophies that'll afford us to bounce between them with consilience or coherence. But maybe we can. All right, that's my pitch.
All right. Forward with it.
All right, brothers. Oh, yeah, always love our gathering. Lots of fun, man.
Always great.
Bye.
Yes. Take care.
All right.
Take care.